Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Becky Hogan. I want to welcome you to Books Between Bites, and I'm going to let George introduce our wonderful speaker who has been working since the day we asked her. She's knocked herself out for this program. I'm so glad so many are here today. But this is our 33rd season of Books Between Bites, and if you are interested, I have a sign up where I'll take your email and send you a monthly reminder about our programs. I'll set it over here, and afterwards come up and just put your name and your email address, and I mail once a month to inform you of the upcoming programs. So without further ado, I'm going to let George introduce our wonderful speaker.
Thank you, Becky. I don't really need notes, but I've got a couple just in case. But I've known Barbara Kalina for a number of years now. We are both work on the Pachakacha Batavia Committee. And actually, now that I say that out loud, a week from today at Shannon Hall, Thursday, October 24th, Shannon Hall, doors open at 5:30, show starts at 7, is Volume 16 of Pachakacha Night Batavia, and we have a wonderful lineup for you. So if you haven't been there ever to a Pachakacha night, and I know it sounds like I'm saying Pikachu or some kind of weird word. It's a wonderful evening, a series of short presentations, very social. We average about 180 people to each event, so it's very lively. And Pachakacha is a Japanese word that means chit-chat, and it's basically little chit-chatty conversations that I think you'll love. But that's not why we're here today. We're here today about Mark Twain. This is the year of Mark Twain in Batavia. 150 years ago, in January 1869, Mark Twain came through Batavia as part of a tour he was doing, a lecture tour, a Lyceum lecture tour, actually, in different cities throughout the Midwest, and Batavia is one of the towns he visited. And Barbara's going to talk about the inspiration for his talk that night in an unknown hall in Batavia, Illinois. Barbara told me that she could speak for 40 hours without notes on Mark Twain, and I told her that you might enjoy just like an hour. With some time for questions. But anyway, Barbara is a lifelong resident of Batavia, loves learning new things about her hometown, but also loves research, as I've learned over the years, and immerses herself completely. And when we came up with the idea as part of the year of Mark Twain in Batavia, and we've had events throughout the whole year, that gee, we should have a Book Between Bites, and it should be about this book. And the first person we thought of was Barbara, because we knew she would do it justice. And with that build-up, I'm going to turn it over to Barbara. Please give her a nice welcome.
Wow. Hope I can live up to that. I'm going to jump into this, so fasten your seatbelts. There is a lot to cover, and I'm not going to cover it all, and I'll probably skip a bunch. When traveling, we carry two forms. Oops, forget to say. When traveling, we carry two forms of baggage, observable and hidden. Attaching themselves like ID tags on luggage, our behaviors often reveal the formative experiences that lie inside our baggage. For 75 years, Samuel L. Clemens, Mark Twain, and I vacillated back and forth between those names the whole time I was reading, the whole time I was writing. Explored the world, expanding his experiences and beliefs, pasting them on the baggage of his memory, influencing his hidden judgments, sharing them with the world. And indeed, he was born under a wandering star.
Blood can make you prisoner.
I thought of that immediately when I thought, how am I going to put this together? He was very proud of the fact that he arrived the year Halley's, I'll get that right yet, comet came past the earth, and he left us the same year. When his traveling, I'm going to have a hard time here. No. Hurrah! His traveling actually began when he was, as a child, he ran around Hannibal, Missouri, and was in all kinds of trouble, so that was kind of traveling. But then when he was 17, he left home as an itinerant printer, went to New York, Philadelphia, went all over the place. He never really grew roots. His roots were mostly in Hartford, Connecticut. He had a house there. I'm not going to say he lived there. He had a house there for 12 years, and he and Olivia lived there at that time. I want you to, those of you especially who are English teachers, and understand that there is a difference between the historical present and the past. I vacillate between the two of them, so bear with me. Innocence could have actually, the TS could have actually been written with a CE, because indeed he was. When he left Hannibal, he was extremely innocent of the world and just soaked everything up like a sponge. He would have denied that out loud, but privately he knew he was innocent of the world. So he had a lot of innocence to get rid of. He experienced his life as one connects fragile paper rings. Not always secure, not always stable. He wanted everyone, the way he wrote, he wanted everyone to engage in his writing, not necessarily some esoteric tome from the East Coast, which at that time dictated the literary taste. He said, mine is not like wine, mine is more like water, and everybody drinks water. I show you the Missouri Civil War map because you see where Hannibal is. He was influenced by his Southern upbringing, so a lot of his baggage that was hidden inside came from those experiences that he had. On the brink of war, as a son of the Southern state, torn between loyalty to the South and personal moral objection to slavery, deep moral objection to slavery, he was torn. He didn't know what to do. He was involved in a non-official regiment for about 2 weeks, ended up killing a man and said, "This isn't right. He did nothing to hurt me or my family. I cannot do this." And so, like Huckleberry Finn, he said, "I reckon I gotta light out for the territory ahead of the rest." And so he went west. In Nevada and California, he wrote for various papers. He was trying on his satire. Out there, it was rough and tumble, and it was accepted. But he found when he came east, his language and the way he wrote wasn't always quite as understood. He found his niche in humor and satire, and maybe that was to cover the lot of sadness in his life, a tremendous amount of sadness and an emptiness. There was not a lot of hugging. There was no hugging in his family when he grew up. The most anyone ever got when they left home was a handshake, mother or father. His writings were popular, but they weren't taken very seriously, and he always lived beyond his means, even after he made a lot of money lecturing and selling his books. He negotiated for pay, almost groveling. I'll write a letter for you if you give me so much money. He made a lot of money lecturing, including the one in Batavia, which he hated lecturing. He hated that whole aspect of standing up there. But he was a natural. He knew how to deliver a lecture and pause, as one of my friends said, Jack Benny, when it was important to pause and get his message across. Those of you who saw the Mark Twain presentation at the Fine Arts Center will recognize that the actor who did that absolutely understood how Twain was able to pause. When he was 35 years old, while he was waiting for Innocents Abroad to be published, he completed this lecture circuit. Now remember, he didn't like lecturing, but he was broke. He needed money. He needed to impress Olivia's family so that he could show them he could be, or would be, a financially secure husband. She came from a lot of money in New York. So he visits Batavia on January 26, 1868, and writes to her saying, "Today this sad-looking village makes me feel ever so friendless and dreary." But remember, he was doing something he really didn't love passionately. He loved reading. He loved writing. He loved communicating with people. He didn't like lecturing. However, remember he's separated from her. He's in love with her, and he finds little, including Batavia, to bring him joy. When he is in San Francisco, he convinces the paper California Alta to sponsor him on the Quaker City pleasure excursion trip to Europe for a series of letters. $1,250 was the cost. Today that would be about $20,000 that he talked the paper into subsidizing his travel. It was the first honest-to-goodness big pleasure travel boat ship that was going to leave from America to Europe. And the Holy Land, that was an important draw. The Quaker City was an re-outfitted Federalist gunboat from the Civil War. After the trip, when he decides he wants to write a book or put them into a book, he discovers the Alta holds the copyright to all of those letters. So he had to go through a lot of machinations in order to gain that copyright, in order to put it into a book. From San Francisco, we would think, oh, simple. No, remember, the Transcontinental Railroad was not yet built. He had to go down from San Francisco, sail down the coast of California, cross. Now, every time he did this, he crossed at a little different place, either Nicaragua or Panama, by train. The first time he did this was cholera. There was a cholera epidemic on ship. He was quarantined for a while, and people were dying and buried at sea, and some people objected to being buried at sea. He didn't understand what the difference was where the worms got you. Besides the money that he received from Alta, he contracted with two papers in New York City in order to gain some more money, which he was always spending a lot of. For instance, if he was going to be paid $10, he would manage to find a place to live that would cost him $11. That was his modus operandi. This trip was so elite and so exclusive that you had to interview and be accepted. He passed it the second time. The first time they weren't sure about him at all, as he came in looking very disheveled, and by the way, he did. He didn't always look pristine and white like we think of him today. It was originally intended only for elite passengers and mostly reverential passengers. The Reverend Henry Ward Beecher was going to be the star passenger and draw all of these people to sail on this wonderful excursion with him. Well, when he backed out, a lot of the elite passengers did as well. General Sherman was also going to be on this ship or this excursion, and guess what? He backed out. So therefore, Mark Twain, being the only one who had some sort of public persona, gained this wonderful big stateroom that he had, number 10. Not looked at fondly by the majority of the passengers. Remember, this voyage was mostly filled with extremely reverential Americans. They came from many states. It wasn't just East Coast reverential people. They came from many states, but they were very serious about going to the Holy Land, and they were very serious about holding services on ship every Sunday. The interesting thing is, everyone was singing all the hymns with gusto, and Mark was the only one who needed the book. He was cynical toward the other passengers, and he believed them to be hypocritical pilgrims. Pilgrims appears frequently throughout this book, and you can see I made some notes. He often wrote tongue-in-cheek descriptions of them, the captain, the crew, as well as the attributes of its ship and the outfitting. Besides pilgrims, he uses the word infidels and believers to describe them. He alternates between finding their company comfortable and uncomfortable. An after voyage, the letter to the New York Herald describes the entire excursion as a funeral excursion without a corpse. Anonymously, he excoriates many of his fellow pilgrims, but they recognize themselves in the news article. He gives special, and not very pleased, they were not, and they let him know. Gives special nicknames to the passengers that match their personalities: the poet, laureate, the oracle, the doctor, and they were not always complimentary nicknames. When you read this, how many of you have read Innocents Abroad? Good for you. It's you deserve some sort of a reader's stripe for doing that. Yes, you have to go back and reread pieces. Did you find that as you read it? Yes, I did too, a whole lot. Mr. Blucher, or I'm sure it's Blucher, appears frequently as someone who's doing something on one of his excursions, but he's not a real character. He's a made-up, fictional character. Twain often does that to pull together a personality and create a new persona. In other of his writings, he calls this fictional individual Mr. Brown. He meets Mary Mason Fairbanks. Interestingly, he does not talk much about the women on the ship at all. Not very often. But he does meet Mary Mason Fairbanks, who is the wife of a Cleveland publisher. And she becomes extremely influential in gentrifying him and helping him to say just the right thing. He eventually calls her mother. She isn't much older than him, well, maybe 10 years older. Remember, he's 32. He's pretty young when he goes on this trip. He doesn't fit into the intent of the voyage as a religious pilgrimage at all. His cabin number 10 is filled with like-minded passengers, or those that are intrigued by his renegade behavior, and he calls these people that congregate in number 10 the sinners. His Dan Sloat was his cabin mate, and this is what he wrote home about him. I have got a splendid, immoral, tobacco-smoking, wine-drinking, godless roommate who is as good and true and right-minded a man as ever lived. That gives you an idea of the complexity of this man. He behaved toward God as a jilted lover, which I thought an interesting explanation. But he always maintained his Christian beliefs. He easily found friendships among the movers and the shakers wherever he went, wherever he traveled. The passengers' views of Clemens were such. He had a drawl, and his word choice wasn't always what their more refined eyes and ears appreciated. He had demonstrated innocence of public norms, and Livy was not yet in the picture, so he would be concerned about making them softer and nicer and more appropriate and acceptable. His language became a guidepost for other passengers or pilgrims' attitudes toward him. They were either drawn toward him or held him at arm's length. He drank a sufficient amount, but he didn't do that until he went west, because he had promised his mother he would not do any of these sinful things. But he soon took up smoking and drinking and using profane language. He was in the minority of passengers. He was suspect because he didn't fit in with this religious atmosphere of the rest of the passengers, even though Reverend Beecher was a very good friend of his. He made dear friends of many people of the cloth throughout his life, and he even asked to write a letter of recommendation to Olivia's father. His influences, and remember what I said about the baggage we carry inside, and we're going to see that in Innocents Abroad. His young life was limited to a small Missouri river town. His experiences and his beliefs and how narrow they were. He assimilated the language and nuances of the southern river town, characteristics that he later tries to override in his public, but not necessarily writing life. He was very much aware of the properness of Olivia's family. This is a facsimile of the ship. It's a paddle wheel on either side, and it was very big. And we're probably going to look at this the rest of the time. He departed New York on June 8, 1867 for a 5-month pleasure and educational cruise. It was the first one, so organized, and they no sooner lifted anchor than they encountered a storm that kept them inshore for 2 or 3 more days. His first stop was Portugal Azores, an island in the West Pacific. Over here. I had to look that up. Belonging to the Portuguese. His descriptions of the people seem small-minded, demeaning, xenophobic, racist, and just plain mean. I was shocked. This is the Mark Twain who cleverly taught me when I was young and reading Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn that chicanery and racism were not good. He taught me that through the lovable rascal of Huckleberry Finn. How could this be that he was calling these people despicable, describing them despicably? Or was he practicing his literary ruse of the same unreliable narrator that he does in Huckleberry Finn? I was very confused. Those of you who have read, did you find yourself thinking the same thing? Did his observations really come from the eyes of one who wanted all pilgrims to see with their own eyes? He emphasizes this throughout the book. And interpret with their own minds rather than blindly accepting what others had told them, namely travel books, which he excoriates throughout the book. See it with your own eyes, he kept saying. Or was he the original ugly American? I read on to figure it out. This is his message. Readers, like travelers, must make their own determinations. With abandon, he pillories the sights and sounds and smells of the visited Portuguese people, their communities. He turns to excoriate his fellow observers as well. Here, as throughout his travels, he reveals the larcenous behaviors of the native populations while carefully describing their poverty. He compares, perhaps unfairly, the people and customs encountered not only in the Azores but throughout his voyage with ordinary people and events he experienced in America. At first he compares them all to the Yankee ingenuity and tough individualism, and these are his touchstones as he observes people in the old world. Other American influences within his suitcase, his baggage, include the robust anti-Catholic, anti-Irish, anti-immigrant American attitudes of the time. He picks these up, remember, in Hannibal, Missouri, and they're reinforced as he goes west. And these are a part within him, inside him. Do they jade his preconceptions as he visits cathedrals, shrines, and other holy places and revered art? Alternatively, he describes his fellow passengers from the European, Middle Eastern point of view. He spread his vindictiveness or his not so positive observations almost equally among the people he visited and the people with whom he was visiting. Travel was a wild novelty to us, and we conducted ourselves with no ceremonies, no conventionalities. We always took care to make it understood that we were Americans. Americans. When we found that a good many foreigners had hardly ever heard of America, and that a good many more knew it only as a barbarous province away off somewhere that had lately been at war with somebody, we pitied the ignorance of the old world, but abated not a jot of our importance. Gradually, as the journey progresses, his penchant to pierce pomposity, and he does that throughout his writings, throughout his life, from the time he began writing in Hannibal, Missouri. In the Azores, he's shown the true cross. He describes it as polished as if it were created just yesterday. This relic is the first of many shown in the grand cathedrals or small abbeys throughout Europe, the Middle East, and the Holy Land. All claim authenticity. He determines that he has seen enough of the true nails from the cross to fill a large keg. Later, in the Holy Land, he relates claims by many cathedrals and holy places that have the handkerchief of St. Veronica with Christ's imprint. His written sarcasm saves him from expounding on belief or disbelief. He doesn't need to tell us. He leaves judgment to the reader. Next, he goes to Gibraltar. Isn't that quite a trip when you follow it? He observes a ship with a U.S. flag, and I found this fascinating. Remember, he's so far looking down or making fun of everything he sees. He's filled with awe. The U.S. flag. She was beautiful before. She was radiant now. Many a one on our decks knew then, for the first time, how tame a sight his country's flag is at home compared to what it is in a foreign land. Those of you who have traveled or have been in the military can agree with that. Throughout the voyage and side trips, the passengers ride on donkeys or broken, dispirited horses, experiencing challenges both humorous and painful. Narrow, crooked, and rough streets or pathways compound their riding adventures. Severe saddle blisters line him for a short time of riding and change the manner in which he sees sights, not always riding, often walking. And when you read this book and read the many descriptions of his riding of the mules or the horses, you have to laugh out loud. In each city or population, he describes the dress and appearance of the people, especially the women, giving his score on the level of beauty. Interestingly, as I said before, he rarely mentions the female passengers on the ship. In Gibraltar, the visuals overwhelm him as he describes a riot of colors arising from the multiple ethnicities and the costumes: red, white, yellow, brown, black, blue, as well as the wide variation of skin hues. In contrast, he describes his fellow passengers as the foreign people, a tribe, each wearing the dress of their respective cities, states, or regions, who march in a straggling procession through these foreign places with such an Indian-like air of complacency and independence about them. No one and no thing escapes his satire and evaluation, including himself. At one time, buying a pair of kid gloves in Gibraltar, especially lovely kid gloves, he succumbs to the flattery of a lovely female seller who tells him a gentleman is always known by the ease with which they can put on a pair of kid gloves. All the time she's telling him this, he is tearing the gloves because they are too small and they are not going on easily. It rips in several places. He continues, he pays the bill and assures the seller that he will put the other one on in the street. Needless to say, his companions never let him forget that experience. Then he goes to Algiers. Can we see that? That's not showing, I don't think, up there. Algiers to him represents all that's exotic in the Middle East. He describes the appearance of Moors, Jews, Bedouins, Riffians, Negroes, and all sorts of Arabs. Remember his experiences. The most foreign immigrant he has seen who looks foreign to him would be the Chinese on the West Coast. All these people are new to him. At least in this description, he avoids the N word, which was one thing that I found difficult to read as I read the book. He uses it frequently. But let's go back. What's in his baggage? The experiences of his youth. He had a strong aversion to slavery. He had a strong love of the slaves that he grew up with, their language, their stories, their love that they showed one another. But he doesn't equate the use of the N-word with a pejorative use. He relaxes into the rich history of Algiers there with all of their many, many nationalities. A venerable antiquity, old before the Crusades, Columbus, before Christ. As we read Innocents Abroad, we discover his absolute love and total knowledge of history, ancient history. He has read all of these books. He knows the Bible by heart. But he gives the impression of not knowing much of anything. As he travels, his admiration for the history of a place and for the true artisans of the place come out. They impress him beyond popular impressions, travel book descriptions, which he makes fun of throughout, and pulpit exhortations of their religious import. Although his formal education was limited, Clemens was widely read, as I just said. He appreciated the connections between what he was seeing and what he had learned through literature, history, and the Bible. He never loses an opportunity, however, to castigate those who take advantage of others. In Algiers, he describes the Emperor of Morocco as a soulless despot who takes money as he wishes, especially from those he perceives to be rich, calling it taxation. And it makes being rich a crime. No one wishes to be rich. It was much too dangerous. Then he goes to Paris, where they hire a guide, finally. Because they don't understand him, and their French is not very good, and the guide's English is not very good, in spite of his claiming it is, they call him Ferguson. From that point on, every single guide they hire is called Ferguson. It's just easier. He observes a royal parade for Napoleon III and Abdulaziz, the Lord of the Ottoman Empire. The colors and martial presence are noted, but description reeks with bias. Napoleon fares better than Abdulaziz. However, Clemens comments that when Napoleon is gone, perhaps a strong republic will emerge. Notre Dame he describes as dusty, filled with relics that have possibly disputable stories. He questions their authenticity. He goes to a morgue, which seems to be a public place of something you visit, like we go to the park. And he can't understand why people are so excited about looking at dead bodies, many of them unclaimed and many of them grotesque. He goes to Agnières, which is a place where he observes the can-can. And of course, being 32 years old and away from home, he's very interested in seeing the can-can, which is truly a peasant dance. At the Louvre, he looks at the old masters, and he sees them as nauseous adulations by princely patrons, by the artists. Meaning, he doesn't understand why so many of the portraits are of royalty and important people. He longs for reality. And remember, that's what he tells the reader to do. See with your own eyes. See what life really is. The Paris Exposition is going on. He's very excited about going there. He skips the Egyptian exhibit because he's going to Egypt. And guess what? When he gets to Egypt, it's all in Paris. He satirizes many of the tourist attractions and beliefs. There is an important place to go that the Parisians or the French show him. A story of Abelard and Heloise. And if you read the whole thing, it's a debauchery and esteem simultaneously. He doesn't understand that. He makes fun of the practices by the French to lure tourist buyers. The discussion seemed to indicate that he believes the French to be unscrupulous. He wants to see a grisette, which is a working class French girl or a young woman who combines work with prostitution. When I looked the word up, however, I didn't find those definitions. All I found was a grisette is a type of low-alcohol beer. In Versailles, Louis XV had 3,600 men doing back-breaking work, causing multiple deaths, bodies hauled away by cartloads that were considered an inconvenience by the royalty, by Louis and his friends, and even the nobles he encounters on his trip in France. But he acknowledges Versailles is spectacular. There's an uncomplimentary comparison he makes between Versailles and Faubourg Saint-Antoine, and I didn't take French, so I'm murdering these. It's an impoverished town with a type of citizens who I think he identifies with, who bring revolutions. Perhaps that is his touchstone and his hope for a solid republic after Napoleon II. In Italy, he's not impressed with the art masterpieces. He sees the crumbling paint and canvases. He sees multiple cathedrals with more relics, often claimed to be the same ones he has seen before, and that he finds again: St. John's ashes, the crown of thorns, bones of St. Denis, portrait of Madonna painted by St. Luke, looking fresher than those painted by Rubens, later nails from the cross again. He sees grand houses and palaces of previous times as worn and uninspiring. In Milan, the descriptions are straightforward, without romanticism, in contrast to the ecstatic description as the travel books. He describes exactly what his eye sees, and he wants all of his companion travelers and us to do the same. He has a remembrance of a hideous experience as a boy. He had crept into his father's office late at night, and he mentions this because of the things he sees, the morgue in France, etc., rather than go home because he was late and he wanted to avoid a thrashing. As moonlight revealed a human hand of a dead body killed the day before outside the office and placed there for keeping during the night, he was frightened. It haunts him throughout his life. And he says, it is hard to forget repulsive things. He chastises the immense amount of gold and silver used in churches and other places of worship. At the sarcophagus of St. Charles Borromeo, it's covered with gold, silver, and jewels. He sees death as the ultimate majesty. You that worship the vanities of earth, you that long for worldly honor, worldly health, worldly fame, behold their worth. Death is the ultimate reward. He shows sympathy for the underdog, the losers of life, throughout. He expresses disdain for the old and the ancient that are revered by others. For example, The Last Supper. He sees many artists copying it, and he suggests that the copies are better than the original. To those expressing wonder at the original Clemens wonders, how can they see what is not visible? He decries the lack of authenticity. Portraits of the Virgin and saints resemble the nationality of the painter, not of the persons depicted. He sees hypocrisy and need to look with his own eyes, and again encourages us to look with our own eyes. He's traveling through Italy, sees gory artwork displayed in houses in a negative light. Happy, cheerful, contented ignorance, superstition, degradation, poverty, indolence, and everlasting, uninspiring worthlessness. In Venice, and we can see where he's going now. At first he laughs at the gondoliers, but later he sees the art with which they move the gondolas, as well as the mechanics and the structure of the gondolas. He begins to look at something through someone else's eyes and the people who are using it. He takes Americans to task for affectations and trying to appear more European and doing it badly with faux French use and accents, continuing to pierce pretentious behavior. He puts down romanticizing and adoration of the past, the profusion of paintings and sculpture of martyrs, rather than reality. He thinks that artists are kowtowing to the dollars of royalty and rich instead of to the authenticity of life. And if those of you who have read him recognize that is what he emphasizes, the authenticity of life. His Venetian guide is the first one who truly knows anything, and they still call him Ferguson. He's a Negro whose parents were slaves. He's more knowledgeable and educated than any of the previous guides and more literate than some of Clemens' own companions. He relates, Negroes are deemed as good as white people in Venice, so this man feels no desire to go back to his native land. His judgment is correct. His attitude toward race arises because he was raised with strict Calvinist beliefs. His mother was a very pious woman, uneducated, not very literate, never caught on to his jokes, but very pious. He followed the precept that slavery was permitted through biblical references taught in Sunday school. As time passed, however, he had difficulty reconciling the belief with what he saw and what his individual morality informed. His family owned slaves. Jenny was considered a part of the family, but then she was sold because his father was not a good money manager. Neither was his brother Orion, and obviously neither was Mark. His writings, his language, his cadences were influenced by Uncle Daniel, a beloved slave on his uncle's farm, and is possibly the basis for Jim, the character in Huckleberry Finn. He was entranced by the music of slave language and speech patterns. He began questioning religion and religious beliefs, a part of his journey from innocence. And remember, what I said, he behaved toward God as a jilted lover. He goes to Florence, and again he sides with the underdogs of history. He berates the extravagances of the church. Now remember the time in which he is writing this. Very important not to make judgments based on 2019, but rather judgments that permeated the culture of America in 1869. But he praises the work of the Dominican friars who nursed the sick during a cholera outbreak. The Papal States police can confiscate one of his jokes because they believe it to be incendiary against the government. He tries to explain the joke to them. They don't get it. He suggests that Romans and Italians seem lazy because they have nothing new to see or discover and should go to America to see the advances, as simple as having a glass or cup of milk without the cow or goat being milked at the doorstep. He praises all the inventions and discoveries of Americans. In general, that which democracy breeds. Is he becoming homesick? He writes a satirical piece about the grandeurs of the Colosseum entertainment. It's too long to read here, but if you have a pencil and a paper, don't forget, do look it up. It's on chapter 26, and in my version, it's page 200. It is funny, but it is long. From the sanguinary sports of the Holy Inquisition, the slaughter at the Colosseum, and the dismal tombs of the catacombs, I naturally pass to the picturesque horrors of the Capuchin convent. The decor in the underground of this convent is a vault in which the deceased monks' bones are knotted and knitted to fit the arches and lining the walls. Frequently, the ship is quarantined throughout the voyage, and passengers cannot go ashore. There are serious epidemics of cholera throughout the trip, as he had experienced when he came from San Francisco. Cholera is a present, almost epidemic at that time in these places. While climbing Mount Vesuvius, the adage is, see Naples and die. Well, he says, I do not know that one would necessarily die after merely seeing it, but to attempt to live there might turn out a little differently. It's lovely from a distance, horrendous within. The Italian journey reminds Clemens of the unsubstantial, unlasting character of fame, and it reminded me, literature teachers, of Shelley's poem, Ozymandias, where all that remains from a grand ruler are stumps of marble in the sand that once were his legs, as well as a shattered visage. And then he goes to Athens. Clemens and 3 others break the quarantine. The boat is not only not allowed to disembark the passengers, but they have to move out of the harbor. So he and 3 others take a small boat, steal a small boat, and take it to shore. They evade the sentries who are watching to make sure none of these people are coming on board and bringing cholera to them. These men hike up the Acropolis and the Parthenon, and this is a funny journey on their part. They steal grapes going up and down the long hike. It's arduous. They find one impasse after another, including being unable to enter through the gate when he finally gets to the Acropolis. But they find some Greek guards to bribe, and so they get in. He is overwhelmed at the majesty of the place in spite of its ancient age. The remains of statues and columns in the moonlight, as well as the view of Athens from the battlements of the hill, cause him to write accolades that he does not give to the grand cathedrals of Europe. Interesting. I found that vastly interesting. My impression, this chapter about ancient Athens, Greece, is one of the most laudatory chapters of the places he visited and are mentioned in this book. He relishes in connecting what he sees with what he knows from history. He soaks in the beauty overhead, the stately columns, majestic, still in their ruin, underfoot the dreaming city, in the distance the silver sea. Not on the broad earth is there another picture half so beautiful. Followed down the hill, 13 miles, by guards, whom he calls brigands, they ditch their ill-gotten booty of grapes that are stolen from a vineyard. They are chased by multiple dogs. They evade a police boat looking for quarantine breakers. They finally find their boat and return to the ship. And then they discover that 2 other passengers skipped the ship that night, went into Piraeus, hired a carriage, evaded capture and imprisonment, and never walked a step. Clemens' response is, I admire cheek. Not as complimentary about modern Greece. The fleets that were the wonder of the world when the Parthenon was new are a beggarly handful of fishing smacks now, and the manly people that perform such miracles of valor marathon are only a tribe of unconsidered slaves today. Oh, how history changes us. He goes to Constantinople. You can find it up there. Constantinople makes a noble picture, but its attractiveness begins and ends with its picturesqueness. Ashore it was, well, it was an eternal circus. He finds and describes multitudes of beggars throughout this part of the voyage and remarks the cripples of Europe are a delusion and a fraud by comparison of the cripples that he sees in this part of the world. He satirizes what remains of the slave market in Turkey. The poor sell their daughters so that all may eat. They may eat, and the daughters may eat. The Sultan has 800 wives. Oh, he says, almost accounts for bigotry. Fraudulent souvenirs irritate him. The passengers collect relics, chips off the Sphinx, pebbles and stuff labeled willy-nilly, cannonballs, teeth. He, Blucher, remember, fictional character, has already turned his stateroom into a museum of worthless trumpery. He observes there is no reverence for the solemn monuments of the past. A contingent from the ship meet the Russian emperor, his immediate and extended family. Now, this is quite unusual for just ordinary people to have an audience with the emperor. He's nervous about what to wear and how to behave, but he's put at ease by the family of Alexander II, described as gracious and welcoming, putting the American contingent at ease. The contingent believes they are representing the people of America, not the government. Historians in there, what happens to Alexander II shortly thereafter? He's assassinated in the streets. Going to Smyrna, you can see that. He questions the authenticity of the many stories of the place, especially those of the first century of Christendom, and he uses contradictory evidence. One person says this, another person says that, and they don't always agree. He visits Ephesus. I want to mention something here. There is a noticeable change when he goes from Europe into this part of the world with which he is not quite so familiar, only through biblical stories, etc. And he treats it a little differently. You have to read carefully to pick up on that transition. In Ephesus, he describes its past glories, buildings, and histories. Through Lebanon and his way to Holy Land, they ride decrepit horses, he says. I have a horse now by the name of Jericho. He is a mare. Throughout Trip to Holy Land, he describes the impoverished nature of the people, the land, the exaggeration of the stories told upon it. Again, he deplores the heavy foot of the privileged upon the backs of the poor. He describes how a 40-year trip to the Promised Land must have been. Artistic license supersedes any facts. He visits Noah's grave. He relates that the whereabouts of Moses' grave is unknown. And at Adam's grave, he makes an absurd connection of relationship, bemoaning the fact that he was not there to mourn the passing of his grandfather, Adam. He berates the Ottoman Empire that shows inhuman tyranny. Now remember, the Ottoman Empire at this point in time is still in power. The people within it are poor, but still ground down by a system of obscene taxation, specifically mentioning the impoverished Syrians, who are naturally good-hearted and intelligent. And I wonder, how would he describe the Syria of today? He wonders about the builders of all the enormous temples and the gigantic stone columns that lie in various stages of ruin. Who built them? How did they do it? He describes the cities and geographical places with an authentic eye. Remember, see with your own eyes. He immerses himself in their history. He stands in awe on what has come before and castigates their present condition, both physically and politically. He rages against those who carve their names upon those pieces of antiquity that deserve awe, and against those who insist on riding exhausted, bedraggled horses in haste so that they do not have to ride on the Sabbath. Damascus, though another claims the name, he says, Old Damascus by right is the eternal city. However, he notes it's anti-Christian, preponderantly Mohammedan. He sees them as arrogant and unyielding toward others, even in the marketplace. There he contracts cholera and is forced to rest. Syrian travels has its interesting features, yet to break your leg or have the cholera adds a welcome variety to it. He describes the touring group, and it's too long to read. The distances there are measured in time, not miles. He compares with known American distance and area. The prodigal son goes to a far country, actually it's 40 to 60 miles. The state of Missouri could be split into 3 Palestines, with enough left over for another. While they travel through this arid land, they find water but no trees for shade, or they'll find trees but no water. So they stop when they can, not when they want. He describes the Bedouins as fierce in tale but shabby in reality. He recalls mighty bloody battles from biblical tales. Throughout this part of the book, he recalls the rise and loss of various civilizations. Ashes are the symbol of hopes that have perished, of aspirations that came to naught, of loves that are buried. Size of places and countries amaze him. Considerably smaller than originally believed, one gets a large impression in boyhood that sometimes which he has to fight against all his life. Is this his metaphysical question about his own life? He compares the stories of Esau and Jacob, Joseph and the brothers. And then he questions, who is the most worthy, Esau or Joseph? And his conclusions on that are quite interesting. Clemens has compassion for the human condition as well as morality of our actions. His impression of slavery, he does not agree with it. His language, again, as I said before, does not always concur with his morality and uses the N-word frequently. One of the most astonishing things that have fallen under our observation, he says, is the exceedingly small portion of the earth up there from which sprang the now flourishing plant of Christianity. Pilgrims echo the words from guidebooks instead of seeing with their own eyes and making judgments based on their own observations. They're always amazed, and they do echo, as he says or repeats, what they have read in travel books or what they have been told to believe by others. About Bedouins, he says, I'm not afraid of them because neither Bedouins or ordinary Arabs have shown any disposition to harm us. But I do feel afraid of my own comrades. Religious bias and irony occur frequently. The pilgrims walk up the carpets in a mosque to gather specimens, and Clemens wonders, what would happen if similar was done in our churches? And states, one is the profanation of a temple of our faith. The other, only a profanation of a pagan one. Every day now, old scriptural phrases that never possessed any significance for me, he reminisces, take to themselves a meaning. His baggage is beginning to be unpacked. Experiences becoming shapely landmarks in one's memory. Memories are, he says, the multitudinous photographs of one's mind takes. Revising his anti-Catholic views, the Catholic convents are a priceless blessing to the poor. He sees them ministering to the poor, the homeless, the crippled. Palestine is no more of this workday world. It is sacred to poetry and tradition. It is dreamland. We were glad to have seen the land which was the mother of civilization, but it stopped. The voyage home was monotonous. He makes fun of the passenger who loudly complains about coffee, only to discover it's tea, and the passenger is himself. Remember my shock at the beginning about what seemed to be Clemens' prejudices? In his own words, he says, travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness, and many of our people need it on these accounts. Broad, wholesome, charitable views of men and things cannot be acquired by vegetating in one's little corner of the earth all one's lifetime.
I was born.
Anyone have any questions? I can talk for about 5 or 6 hours more.
I was born
That was good.
under a woman.